Once upon a time, a king received a shocking report about the new harvest. Whoever eats of the crop becomes mad. So he called together his counselors. Since no other food was available, the alternative was clear. Not to eat of the new harvest would be to die of starvation. To eat would be to become mad. The decision reached by the king was this: we will all have to eat, but at least a few of us should continue to keep in mind that we are mad. The parable from Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav appears in Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel's essay on the confusion of good and evil. It's a topic I've been thinking about a lot since the massacre of October 7th and the immense suffering of far too many Israelis and Palestinians during the 3 months since. But bigger than the war itself, and it's hard to conceive of anything bigger since the enormity of the war is not lost on me, but swirling around the events in Israel and Gaza these past 90 days have been toxic clouds carried on ancient winds. Antisemitism is a light sleeper, Irish scholar and statesman Conor Cruz O'Brien once said, and we all know it has awakened with a vengeance. We've seen anti-Semitic incidents rise over 300% in the US since October 7th, but of course it's been less dormant for a long time in many places around the world. Ancient tropes made excellent cannon fodder as Hamas weaponized hate and gained sympathizers across the globe. I was struck by something Persian Jewish master cook Ora Egbali said at our first Lox and Learn this week. Ora described growing up in Iran before and after the fall of the Shah. She detailed the lies that she had to tell to escape and the regular bribes that Jews who remained, not just Jews, but Jews who remained, including her older sister, are required to pay just to lead somewhat normal lives, sometimes even to survive. The other shoe is always ready to drop in Jewish communities, it seems. Israelis too, powerful though their military is, in some way live this way, though they've learned the hard way more pointedly than any time since the Yom Kippur War, that second shoe is no abstraction. Palestinians within Israel too are waking up to this reality, as Abed al-Mughani and Mahmoud Abu Ammar detailed in a New York Times piece this past week about their brother Sohaib, who was captured then murdered by Hamas after he drove as a bus driver partygoers to the Nova Music Festival and not wanting to leave without his passengers. The Heschel essay I mentioned is from a book called The Insecurity of Freedom. This insecurity of never quite knowing where you stand or who you can trust is a too familiar feeling for Jews, isn't it? We've been called the ever-dying people, but that expression is more about internalized Jewish anxiety, about whether we'll hold fast to that which has sustained us over millennia, our traditions, our faith, transmitting our stories and values l'dor vador from one generation to the next. I'm not sure about the ever-dying designation, but that we are an ever-threatened people is hard to question. In this year of our people's resilience, our elasticity is being tested like no time in my lifetime, nor probably in most of yours. Reflecting this deep sense of insecurity, our Parsha this week begins with an ominous declaration. Vayakom melech hadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yada et Yosef. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Motivated, it seems, only by the Hebrews' growth in numbers, which is to say, by our very existence, Pharaoh puts in place a series of draconian measures, forcing our ancestors into slavery, denying them property rights, and ultimately, in a foreshadowing of the worst horrors of Jewish history, including this past October, slaughtering their babies. What changed, we might ask? Was it just that they had become large in numbers? When the text says, "V'timale ha'aretz otam," the land was filled with them, does this mean that they had not just grown in population, but moved out of Goshen into other neighborhoods, into non-Jewish neighborhoods? Certainly, we know this has been a quote-unquote sin of our people and other maligned groups of people in plenty of other contexts. One commentator, though, takes a more pointed and deeply problematic approach. Rabbi Ovadia Sforno suggests the Hebrews had become something less than human, and certainly less than the nobility of Joseph's generation. They did not deserve, he seems to imply, Pharaoh's good graces. And this kind of thinking is the dark undercurrent of our question about the king who did not know Joseph, of broader questions about anti-Semitism, really, because how often do we have to contend with so-called bad Jewish actors implicated in Jewish suffering? How often have we heard someone say, or maybe we've said ourselves, that person, Bibi Netanyahu, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Elise Stefanik, Sally Kornbluth, Stephen Miller, George Soros, Bernie Sanders, Miriam Adelson, AIPAC, JVP. Pick your bad Jew, your bad family, your bad Jewish organization. The through line is that they are what? A shanda legoyim, an embarrassment to us in front of our non-Jewish neighbors. She's increasing anti-Semitism, we say. They're putting the entire Jewish people at risk, we opine. That one, he's bad for the Jews. And I want to say two things about this tendency for us to blame ourselves for hatred of us, for violence against us. First, there are Jews out there doing and saying things that are ill-informed, sometimes even hateful. We don't have to pretend otherwise. Second, when we Jews fall into the trap of self-blame, we only exacerbate the problem. We all have to eat, taught Rabbi Nachman in his parable, but the crop is poisoned. And we're always at risk of forgetting anti-Semitism is a madness that infects civilizations like a virus. Sometimes, like now, it runs the risk of rising to pandemic levels. We must talk less, my friends, about who among us is bad for the Jews and talk more about simply who is behaving badly, interpreting Torah poorly, and sometimes dangerously. If some Jews are wielding power or money or influence in dangerous ways, if others are making unsubstantiated claims on social media or using inflammatory rhetoric in op-eds, we should say so. But let's be careful not to flatten any people, including maybe especially our own people, into one facet of their identity. Who someone is so much bigger and richer than what someone is. The what informs the who, but as Whitman put it, each of us is large and contains multitudes. One example I experienced not long after October 7th was a neighbor and I thought a friend who was posting some really offensive things on her social media and claiming essentially that Israel only and Jews only were to blame for the atrocities of October 7th, not simply taking a position about the war or the Israeli response, but really saying that the only reason that women were raped and children were murdered and the elderly were taken into captivity was because of Jewish presence in the land. And when I confronted this person and said, would you consider reading this article? Would you consider looking at this from a different perspective, trying to engage them? The response was, well, I'm just following, the lead of Jewish Voice for Peace, which one is not a fair characterization of Jewish Voice for Peace, who are not a group that I personally am in favor of, but even that. But two, of course, did the thing that people do when they want to trot out the good Jews. The best way to temper our haters' tendency to point to the good Jews to cover for their own bigotry is to remind them that there aren't good Jews or bad Jews. There are just Jews, sometimes behaving well, sometimes behaving badly. We're all accountable to something greater than ourselves or our self-interests. But I also think that there's something deeper and more insidious at work here. What animates these questions of blame and self-blame, of how to grapple with the ancient scourge of anti-Semitism in this fraught moment, I think, is really about fear. At our core, we're not really afraid of the king who did not know Joseph. What we're really afraid of is being hated by those who do know us, whom we have trusted, with whom we've built alliances, or short of being hated, being misunderstood, or just ignored. So many of us are feeling a strain in the bonds that have connected us to others. The elasticity, not just of our identities, but also our relationships, is being tested as never before. On our verse from Shemot, Rashi brings a dispute between Rav and Shmuel, 3rd century Babylonian sages who disagreed about the identity of this quote-unquote new king. Rav says, Chadash Mamash, this was truly a new pharaoh. The time had passed and the connection between Joseph and the monarchy was lost. But Shmuel notices, unlike other biblical descriptions of monarchical reigns, here at the beginning of Exodus, we're never told that the king has died. There's no, the king is dead, long live the king. Which means, says Shmuel, something infinitely more frightening. It was exactly the same Pharaoh, the one who liberated Joseph, the one who put him in his employ, the one who had, at his behest, Joseph bring his family down to Egypt, the same guy who now placed the Hebrews into slavery. Now he acted, quote, like someone who had not known Joseph at all, says the sage Shmuel. Heschel wrote his essay, Confusion of Good and Evil, about the influential thought leadership of his close friend and colleague Reinhold Niebuhr. Niebuhr was a leading Protestant theologian of the 20th century and worked just across the street from Heschel's JTS at Union Theological Seminary. It's Niebuhr and Heschel's willingness to name the complex relationship between good and evil that I suggest can be our guide in confusing times like these. Because it's not just anti-Semitism, of course, that infects the human condition, but evil itself. It may have been possible prior to 1914, wrote Heschel in 1956, to believe with Herbert Spencer, who in his Evanescence of Evil asserted that evil perpetually tends to disappear. But the horrors through which we have lived in the past 40 years have totally discredited such simple, easygoing optimism, says Heschel. Many Israelis and many of us are saying similar things after October 7th. Where Heschel parts way with Niebuhr is in our Jewish insistence not on easygoing optimism, but on the inevitability of evil. Torah accepts, in fact, warns us over and again of the possibilities of evil, but not its inevitability. We believe that there are corners full of light in the vastness that is dark, he writes. Jewish tradition, while conscious of the possibilities of evil in the good, stresses the possibilities of further good in the good. That's why Shimon ben Azai teaches mitzvah goreret mitzvah, that one mitzvah leads to another. The trick, however, is separating out the good from the bad, and it's not always clear which is which, is it? Heschel says, more frustrating than the fact that evil is real, mighty, and tempting is the fact that it thrives so well in the disguise of the good. In this world, it seems the holy and the unholy do not exist apart, but are mixed, interrelated, and confounded. As our mystical tradition points out, the confusion of good and evil, as what Heschel calls the central problem of history, is rooted in the very moments of creation. Think about the first verses of Genesis. Light and dark, good and evil were bound up together before God made any distinction between them. God separates the elements, ascribing positive moral traits to some. Vayere, vayivoker, vehine tov ma'od. There was evening, there was morning, and behold, it was very good. The supreme task of man, Heschel writes, his share in redeeming the work of creation consists in an effort to separate good from evil and evil from good. Since evil can only exist parasitically on good, think about that for a moment, it will cease to be when that separation will be accomplished. Redemption, Heschel claims, in a Jewish idiom at least, is not about personal salvation, but an iterative process through which we're constantly teasing apart good from evil. And this is the secret, I think, of how we navigate tricky moments and sticky issues like this week's resignation of Harvard President Claudine Gay. To keep in mind that because of the closely woven relationship between our better and our baser instincts, we should be able to carry multiple truths and resist platitudinous and reductive assumptions. Without going too much into the details here or my specific feelings on the matter, I want to close by naming a concern and a solution to that same concern. My concern is that Claudine Gay has become not a person, but a prop, a foil for a range of perspectives. Some of these may be healthy and reasonable, some of these hateful, destructive, and dehumanizing. We need to be able to name this, that there is good and bad to be found in much of the discourse in general, but also this week around anti-Semitism, racism, the purpose of higher education, to name just a few of the issues that have come up. Leaving aside the plagiarism question, which I honestly feel completely unqualified to comment on, some would say that, for example, to name the insecurity many Jews are feeling on many college campuses and the responsibility of leaders to protect their Jewish students and faculty while also raising concerns about the takedown, largely by illiberal and bad faith actors, of Harvard's first black woman president is wishy-washy whataboutism. But I would argue that Jewish tradition contains actually a sophisticated model for providing context. Yes, context is a good and necessary thing if applied in the right way, in the right time and place. And that model is what we call machloket l'shem shamayim, arguments for the sake of heaven. This holy arguing assumes not just the likelihood of disagreement, but the utility of disagreement. As we learn from the Talmud in Masechet Ta'anit, Rabbi Chama said in the name of Rabbi Hanina, what is the meaning of Proverbs 27, iron sharpens iron? It means that in the case of iron, one sharpens its fellow, so too when Torah scholars sharpen each other in halakha. Whataboutism is a real thing, and it's a dodge. It's an attempt to distract or deflect from someone's legitimate concerns. But machloket l'shem shamayim is an embrace, a celebration of discourse, of holy possibility, of thesis and antithesis giving birth to synthesis. Here's the hard truth. We cannot control the haters, the pharaohs who don't know us because, well, they don't want to know us, or who don't question the worst claims about us the minute some of us do some things that they find objectionable. Incuriosity is a modern plague worthy of ancient Egypt. But to live in a Jewish life, or to live a Jewish life, is to insist on the possibilities of goodness, which means we have no choice but to live our lives in the margins, to express our values in public, to insist on our history, our trauma, but also our joy, our humor, our wisdom, our place in the marketplace of ideas, our right to self-identify and self-determine, our light among the community of nations. We may be confused about a lot right now. I find myself confused kind of on a daily and weekly basis. But about this, I'm crystal clear. Let's not play the games of the cynical, the cavalier, or the cruel. As the late, great Elijah Cummings liked to say, we're better than that. Shabbat Shalom.